One thing we have to discuss with polychords, again, because there are so many notes in them, they get so rich, is what Persichetti calls resonance. Another way of thinking of resonance is how much fusion is there between the elements. Let's look at example 19A. 19A, we have a C major chord underneath and a G major chord on top. But since those notes fit pretty well into the harmonic series of C major, there's a lot of fusion. Out of context, that could be just a simple ninth chord, or it could be a polychord with the right orchestration and the right situation. But the important thing, as a polychord, it's quite gentle. That's the part we're interested in right now. Look at 19B now. 19B is a little less gentle, mainly because that G sharp is in conflict with the G natural underneath. However, we still have two common tones. The two common tones give us quite a lot of blend, and the chord still sounds quite rich. Okay. However, if we start looking a little farther, now we start seeing that, for example, 19C, where we have... Okay. In 19C, we see two more chords. Neither of these chords has any common notes with the ones underneath. However, there is a difference in resonance between them. 19C, first chord is C major with F sharp major. Second chord is C major with B flat major. The difference is that when the notes on top are on the sharp side of the spectrum, the chord tends to sound brighter. The other one, part of the reason for that also has to do with the spacing. In the first chord, there are two strong dissonances, the C to C sharp and the F sharp to G, but they're very far apart. In the second chord, the E to F is right in the middle, which makes the chord much duller. However, even if I put it higher up, which is somewhat better, it's still not as blended or as resonant as that. Other aspects of these chords. For example, we will notice that if we have a choice for the bottom chord of spacing it in an open spacing or a closed spacing, usually an open spacing with a fifth on the bottom will be more resonant. That's 19D. Here's the same chord spaced close on the bottom. It's that fifth on the bottom which gives the chord a kind of openness, which can be very welcome indeed when you're working with these very thick chords. Polychords are also useful for certain kinds of registral effects. If we look at 19E, again, we have the same chord, but in two registers. The first one, second one. Notice in the first chord, it's almost percussive. The lower you get, the more we hear or notice the conflict between overtones. The higher they get, it tends to sound clearer. So this has a kind of light that this does not. So here the difference is not between the notes used, it's between the registers. And sometimes that's enough to make a very big difference. Generally speaking, as part of this aspect of resonance, it's important to evaluate the harshness of polychords. There are many, many different degrees. Let's check out example 19F now. The first one, all three notes on top are dissonant with the notes on the bottom. Actually, it's a D sharp minor chord with an E minor chord. So that's quite a lot of conflict. It's a rather tense and harsh sonority. Second one, in 19F, now we have an E minor chord and a G minor chord. There is one strong dissonance here, the B flat against the B. However, it's less tense than... And now the third chord, which sounds clearer. Why? Because there's no strong dissonances anywhere with any of the notes on the bottom layer. So again, these are ways to control and to observe how these chords behave. Okay, now as usual, we have to talk about cadence. How do we create a sense of cadence in polychords? Let's listen to example 20. In example 20, we can hear a simple polychordal progression. Again, I'm going to play it just the outer parts. Notice that it starts with an octave. There's contrary motion over here, common tone while the left hand leaps, contrary motion, and then they begin and end on the same note. The fact that the last chord and the first chord, especially the last chord, has the same note on the top and the bottom gives it a feeling of being more blended than the chords in between. And that's the reason it helps to sound like a cadence. The rhythm, of course, also contributes. Generally speaking, cadence requires less tension, and what we just did is a way to achieve less tension. It's also possible to use the counterpoint of the outer parts, and the harmonic rhythm to create a sense of cadence. By varying the counterpoint in the outer parts or converging or expanding toward some extreme, either the closest or the farthest spacing, or having the harmonic rhythm slow down or speed up, we can have a sense that the cadence stands out from the rest of the phrase. As with the other 9th and 11th chords we talked about earlier, the big problem with these chords again is heaviness of texture. Let's look at a few ways to thin out a polyharmonic texture. Let's listen to example 21. You'll notice in the example I've actually marked 3 letters, 21A, 21B, and 21C. This is just because each letter indicates a different technique for lightening the texture. The first technique for lightening up is just ornamentation. Instead of hitting the chord completely, arpeggiating, and the next bar, much lighter than if I just repeated the whole chord entire. Then at 21B, there's nothing wrong with lightening the texture further into just 2 notes for a moment. Then the last chord, okay, at 21C, you have a chord with 2 common tones, E flat and G. So again, it blends more than the ones at the beginning. You can see in this example that these various techniques for reducing the texture have the effect of making the harmonic density much more variable and in fact more interesting. It's usually not a good idea to have a long passage or even a whole piece with the same level of harmonic tension constantly. So these ways of lightening the texture contribute to making the piece more supple. There are a couple of other ways to lighten the texture for which we have other examples. Let's listen to 21D. Here what we've got is real parallel chords in each layer. Top layer, bottom. So although we still have independence, because the 2 layers aren't going the same direction, in effect this really is 2-part counterpoint fattened up because there's no variety at all in the middle parts. Another way of using these chords we can see in example 21E. Here you can see that the first part of the phrase, the first 2 bars, really just consists of ordinary 7th and 9th chords with an 11th chord in measure 2, but the real polychord is the last chord. Notice the big change in register. The chords are quite dissonant with each other. They're a semitone apart, an E flat chord and a D major chord. So in the context of this phrase, it creates a sudden accent, which can be an excellent reason to use a polychord. Again, let's listen to 21E. The last thing I want to say about polychords is just to refer, just very briefly, the possibility of polyharmony with more than 2 layers. More than 3 generally tends to be inaudible. We just end up with too many notes sounding together and the result becomes chaotic. Polychord harmony with 3 layers is possible occasionally, especially if the orchestration helps out. If the orchestration gives you different tone colors, and especially also if it's an unusual texture. For a whole piece, it would tend to be overly dense. For a short passage, it can be quite useful for a climax. As a rule, when you're doing polyharmony with more than 2 layers, try and keep open spacing on the bottom to keep a certain amount of clarity. Try and have some common tones between the layers. And at least to some extent, base the upper chords on overtones of the lower notes. The point of all this is to create a rich texture that isn't so heavy as to be unlistenable.